Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Today we're going to talk about protozoa from kind of an evolutionary perspective. Remember, this is animal biology and we're interested in animals, but we have to look at the precursors to animal life. So what gave rise to the animal kingdom? And most of the evidence, scientific evidence, suggests that protozoa did, especially this group of protozoans, which we call the channel flagellates. Okay? They have very similar features with kind of a collar, a flagellum, okay, that we see in primitive animals like sponges and even cnidarians. So we're going to look at protozoa, but keeping in mind, that we're looking at the features and the classification and kind of what gave rise to modern animals or the kingdom Animalia. All right, so from an evolutionary perspective in Protista, they are ancient. Um, Somewhere maybe 1.5 billion years ago did they kind of separate and diverge from Archaea. Okay, so remember there's three domains. You have bacteria or eubacteria, the true bacteria domain, the Archaea domain, and the eukarya domain. Okay? Now we know that Protista is a eukarya, and so about 1.5 billion years ago is when those two, Archaea and eukarya, diverged from each other. Now here's the problem that we find when we start looking at protists is that they're very diverse, and normally we can classify things into, well, how do they feed? So the kingdom of Animalia, we know that they're all heterotrophs. So that was pretty easy. That's one feature that you can say. And when we look at the kingdom Plantae, we know that they're all autotrophs. Easy separation. But when we look at things like Protista, there are autotrophs and heterotrophs, and some organisms that are both. So the classification can be very difficult, and currently it's understudied. So when we start trying to look for a monophyletic grouping, it's very difficult. And so right now, our understanding of protists is that they're not monophyletic, they're polyphyletic. There's quite a few different ancestral lines, okay, giving rise to the modern forms of protists. And we're going to talk about those lines. We're going to talk about the evidence for those lines in this lecture and following lectures. So here you can see the classification. Remember, we're talking mainly about animals, but prior to animals, we're talking about protists. Okay? And you can see that each one of these protist lines has its own ancestral connection. So the interesting piece about that is if you look at some of the data, some data suggests that we actually should have 5 or 6 kingdoms of protists. So we would have to separate them out into 5 or 6 kingdoms. Right now we lump them all together into a single kingdom, which we call protists. But in the future, either they are connected through a single ancestor, and we can keep them all under the single heading protists, okay? Or they all have their own ancestor, and we need to start breaking them up. So in the future of taxonomy and protists, you're going to see some of these changes occur. Okay? When we move to porifera and cnidarians, okay, it's a similar story. So even within the animal kingdom, we have some groups that we lump together, but they probably shouldn't be lumped together because they have separate ancestral lines. But we'll come back and we'll talk about that when we get to porifera and cnidaria. Okay, so some protists, like I said before, are plant-like, so they're autotrophic, produce their own food, and then some protists are animal-like and are heterotrophic, so they feed on other organisms. Now, the protists that are plant-like gave rise to the kingdom Plantae. The protists that are animal-like gave rise to the kingdom Animalia and the kingdom Fungi. And so protists really play a large role in kind of the greater kingdoms that we often talk about. The kingdoms that are more familiar to people, like fungus and plants and animals, are much more familiar than bacteria or protista to the everyday person. So it's the protists that really gave rise to those kingdoms that we now spend most of our time studying. Protozoans, so they also can occur as single-celled organisms, okay? Or they can occur as combined, like multiple cells or a colonial organism. And we'll talk about some examples of this. The protozoans that are what we call single-celled life, they can complete all their activities, all the life cycle within a single cell, and so they have organelles that allow them to do that. So organelles that allow them to reproduce, produce their own food or eat, digest, immune system, all this within this single plasma membrane. Now, we're going to talk about some of these organelles. We're going to talk about some of these unique features depending on what the species is, but we're going to talk about some of them as we progress. And you'll see that some of the organelles are very similar to animal organelles, and then some of the organelles are very similar to plant organelles, and some organisms have both. So here you can see this is a typical protozoan. Maybe this protozoan doesn't actually have all these features, but these are features that you would find in protozoa. So often they'll have a way to move, either via a flagellum, or maybe they'd have cilia, which are kind of basically smaller flagellum all over the body. They often have a way in which they can feed, and so they might have a cytopharynx, right, which would allow them to phagocytize food and put it in a food vacuole. Right? And so they would enter, it would enter and have a membrane around it. And so this might be bacteria or other smaller protozoans, and they would consume it. A lot of them that are consuming food, like in food vacuole, are going to have lysosomes, which are going to have digestive enzymes, and just like our lysosomes, and that would then be expelled into these food vacuoles so they could digest the food and then use those food for the mitochondria, okay, those kind of things. In this case, they have a true nucleus, a nucleolus, that's the site where ribosomes are made, okay, a rough endoplasmic reticulum, and some of them have a smooth endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus where proteins are packaged, etc. So if you remember from previous bio classes, this is a lot of animal-like features, and then you have some of these other features that are kind of unique to protozoan, but have similar features can be found in things like plants. So you got this contractile vacuole. Sometimes this vacuole can be utilized to hold water. Other times it maybe is utilized to hold ions and things like that might be needed to drive either the electron transport chain or something along those lines. So you can have these vacuoles with contractile tubing that can house some of those materials. Also can house waste products, so it's a good way to get rid of waste and whatnot. So there's a lot of unique features. Not all protozoans have these features, and we'll talk about those situations. Okay, so again, protozoa, when they absorb food or nutrients, they do it through endocytosis. Now, if you remember from previous bio classes, there's two kind of forms of endocytosis. One form is what we call phagocytosis, and that's when large particles of food are consumed, brought in, put into a vacuole. And then the other form is what we call pinocytosis, which is when liquids are kind of consumed and put into a vacuole. But endocytosis is the means by which nutrients can be dissolved or brought in to the organism's body. Okay? And some organisms, some protozoa, they have that specialized region that I showed you before, that cytopharynx, this is where the food vacuole is going to form. And like I said before, it's similar to kind of the way our cells would work if they're going to phagocytize something. They would bring it in into a membrane, and then digestive enzymes would be released to destroy it, and then that whatever that was would be utilized for energetic purposes or whatever, to build other amino acids or whatnot. Now, protozoans have the capability to do kind of unique forms of reproduction. In some cases, they reproduce asexually by binary fusion. And then in other cases, they will reproduce sexually. It's not quite the sexual reproduction that you're familiar with sperm and egg. It's more like conjugation, where they come together and they exchange genetic material. So it's a different kind of form of sexual reproduction, but nonetheless, two genetically distinct individuals will come together and exchange genetic material. Now again, asexual can be in a few different ways. Binary fission, which is probably a carryover from things like bacteria and archaea, which have this form of asexual reproduction. Budding, which would mean that they just kind of form a new asexual individual, break off, release that individual. And then multiple fission would be when the nucleus is not divided into two like binary fission, but it's divided into multiple, and you get a multiple production of offspring in one kind of method. Okay. So here's kind of binary fission. It can happen on the longitudinal or horizontal plane, okay? And the nucleus would just replicate itself, and you get replication of as much material as needed for the organism to survive. Now, it might not be a complete 50-50 split, so you might not actually have the exact same number of mitochondria in the new individual as you did the old individual, but nonetheless, you would have all the parts that are needed. So the nucleus would be split, the organism would split in half, and you'd have basically a genetic clone unless a mutation occurred, a genetic clone, and nearly identical copies of each other. This one might have to make extra ribosomes or extra mitochondria or something along those lines, lysosomes. The new version might. But speaking generically, these are identical to each other. And it can happen along, a different line, the horizontal plane, okay, and same thing, DNA, the nucleus is doubled, DNA is copied, everything's split fairly even, and you get two copies of each other. So here you can see that flagellum, and then here you can see the cilia. They're kind of like small flagella, just a different way of moving through aquatic systems. Protozoans are pretty much all aquatic, or they have to be in a wet environment. So it's not that they have to be in deep water, but they have to be in kind of wet environments in order to survive. And so here's another example of binary fission. Okay, you can see this is like a cleavage furrows forming, so very similar to the way animal cells kind of split. They just pinch off, and you had the DNA was copied, and so you'd have two nuclei, one in this one in this one, and you have basically identical cells. And then that multiple fission, this is kind of a way in which that can happen. Again, you have maybe a parent amoeba, which we'll talk about amoeba in a little bit. They divide their nuclei multiple times, so they create multiple copies of their nucleus. Membranes form around it, and then they release a massive amount of offspring. Again, these are genetic clones of the original parent amoeba. All right, so when we look at protozoans, we also need to look at how their lifestyle or how their life cycles allow for them to they're numerous in numbers and very species rich, but how they get to that point is because they take up different roles in an ecosystem. And so symbiosis is one of those main kind of roles at which you see protozoans form. Okay, so they form some kind of relationship with other organisms. Now, maybe it's a parasite relationship, and we will talk about quite a few protozoans that are parasites on humans, okay, in a couple lectures, or maybe in the next lecture. But they don't always have to form kind of a parasite relationship. And so remember from previous bio classes, maybe you learned about symbiosis. Symbiosis is that connection between two organisms, or two or more organisms in that fact. Okay? Parasitism, which we'll talk about protozoan parasites, is one way you can have a symbiotic relationship, and that is that one organism lives off a second organism, and we call that second organism the host. Now you might have an intermediate host, and you might have a definitive host, and lots of different ways at which the life cycle can work. But parasitism is when one organism lives off another. Now, it's different than predation because parasites are not trying to kill their host. Okay? They're just trying to consume energy from the host. Now, sometimes the host does die, but that defeats the purpose for the parasite because the parasite often needs that host as kind of an incubator so they can reproduce. And so they needs that host to be alive. Versus predation. Predation is, one organism consuming another organism. And so those kind of rules are a little bit different. When we talk about life cycles of parasites, and we will get to some of the parasites that are important for humans, the definitive host is the host that harbors the sexual stage of the parasite. So there may be times at which the parasite goes through asexual reproduction to increase the number of individuals in a body. But when they make it into the definitive host, then you see sexual reproduction in the majority of protozoan parasites. And so, like I said before, it depends on the life cycle. It depends on the protozoan. It depends on what we're talking about. But you can have definitive hosts. You can have intermediate hosts. Okay? And you can even have multiple intermediate hosts in a single definitive host. It really just depends on how complex the sexual or the life cycle of the protozoan is. Like I said before, not all of these protozoan symbiotic life cycles are parasitic or predation or in those realms. Okay, you can also have commensalism, where the relationship benefits one individual, okay, but the other individual is not harmed or has any benefit. And this is often the case when you get a small protozoan infection or something like that in an organism, and that organism really is not harmed or has no benefit from it. So you won't even really call it an infection. You just get like an invasion, but the host would never even know. There's other ways at which this can occur, and we'll talk about some in kind of a little more detail in later lectures. Okay. Mutualism is when you get that symbiotic relationship and both species benefit. Okay. And there's a few examples of this from a protozoan life cycle too, where both species need each other in order to survive. Okay, so with that, we're going to talk about some specific protozoans, and then talk about specific protozoans that kind of have that tie to the kingdom Animalia. We'll talk a little bit about protozoans that have that tie to the kingdom Plantae, just because I want you to be familiar with protozoa in general. But we're concentrating on those that are going to have that tie, that connection to the kingdom Animalia. Okay? So with that said, Next lecture will be specific protozoa.